Story 1. Hell and Truth. Do you believe in hell? James never thought he would find himself in this place. A dark, cold cave with no way out. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the darkness. It was the voice that echoed from the void. Welcome. What awaits him ahead? A demon or something even more horrifying? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next chilling story. Darkness engulfed everything, thick like a shroud trapping James in an oppressive space. The cold slithered through his skin, clinging to him like unseen hands. There was no escape. Towering stone walls loomed around him, imprisoning him in an unknown place. James swallowed hard, trying to remember how he had ended up here. But everything was a blur. Just a moment before. Then the darkness swallowed him whole. It felt as if reality had twisted, dragging him into a place far beyond the world he once knew. A putrid stench filled his nostrils. Not just the damp, musty smell of stone, but the unmistakable odor of decay, of death. His breath quickened, his eyes strained to find even the faintest glimmer of light in the suffocating blackness. But there was nothing, only an abyss of endless darkness. Then, a voice echoed. Welcome. James jolted, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice didn't come from any particular direction. It resonated throughout the space, as if the cave itself was speaking. Deep, haunting, and otherworldly. James forced himself to stay calm. Who's there? He called out, but his own voice echoed back to him, weak and hollow. You know who I am. The word sent a chill down his spine. What was this thing talking about? No, it couldn't be. This had to be just a nightmare. Are you the devil? His voice came out dry and strained. A faint chuckle echoed, not amused, but something more sinister, as if the entity was savoring his fear. Why would I be the devil? James's chest tightened. He had no answer. The silence stretched on, not a peaceful stillness, but a suffocating void, where the darkness felt like it was waiting to consume him at any moment. He couldn't stay here. He had to escape. But how? What did you do? James asked, his voice more unsteady than he wanted. I don't know, the deep voice responded. But you've never believed in anything, have you? The air around him thickened, pressing down on him like an unseen force. Those words sliced through James's mind like a blade, leaving behind a cold, lingering wound. He clenched his fists. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. James stood frozen in the thick darkness, his breath quick and shallow, his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape his chest. The space around him was unnaturally cold. No light, no exit. The silence was suffocating, not peaceful, but terrifying, as if this world had been buried long ago. Every one of his senses sharpened as a chilling thought brushed through his mind. This place was not normal. He was no longer in the world he once knew. This was neither a nightmare nor a hallucination. It was real. So real that every nerve in his body felt paralyzed by it. He tried to recall everything he had ever heard about hell. A place with no escape, where souls were damned for eternity. The warnings of religion, the stories of punishment, the images of a desolate realm. All of it now seemed clearer than ever. If hell truly existed, was this the gateway to it? James swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. The stone walls were cold and rough, as if they had been here since the beginning of time. Beneath him, the ground was uneven, jagged, as though invisible hands had clawed at it for centuries. A gust of wind hissed through the cracks in the rock, but it carried no trace of life, only the stench of rot and decay, as if the air itself had died long ago. He didn't want to believe it, but the truth was undeniable. This was no ordinary cave. This was a place from which no one ever returned. A chill ran down his spine as the realization struck him. He might have crossed the boundary between the world of the living and something far worse. A gateway that should never be entered. A realm where lost souls were trapped forever. James took a step back, but behind him was nothing but endless darkness. He had no idea how he had arrived here, nor whether there was any way out. One thing, however, was certain. He was not alone. The silence was suffocating. James stood in the darkness, his breath quick and uneven, every muscle in his body tensed with fear. There was no wind, no sound of life, only an eerie stillness that pressed in from all sides. He felt as if he were being watched, but he couldn't tell from where. Then, suddenly, a voice echoed through the void. "Welcome." James flinched, his heart hammering against his chest. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, reverberating off the unseen walls, spreading through the space as if the very air had spoken. It was deep, slow, unhurried, but carried an overwhelming weight. Someone was here. The darkness around him became infinitely more terrifying. James instinctively stepped back, but the uneven ground beneath his feet reminded him that there was nowhere to go. His breathing quickened, his chest tightening under the crushing sense of dread. "Who's there?" He forced the words out, trying to steady his voice, but it trembled more than he had expected. There was no immediate answer, only silence. A silence that stretched just long enough to let fear seep into his bones, to let the uncertainty twist its way into his mind. James swallowed hard, the unsettling sensation of unseen eyes fixated on him making his skin crawl. Then the voice spoke again, slowly, deliberately. "You know who I am." The air around him seemed to thicken. A cold chill ran down his spine. He didn't want to believe what was forming in his thoughts, but the voice, there was something disturbingly familiar about it. Something that did not belong to this world. James clenched his fists, not to fight, but to keep himself from shaking. He had no idea what awaited him in the abyss, but one thing was certain. He was no longer in control of his fate. Something had welcomed him into this place, and it had no intention of letting him leave. James felt his entire body turn ice cold. Every nerve in him stretched so tight it hurt. That voice, it didn't come from any single direction. It surrounded him, seeped into his mind, wrapping around him like an unseen presence. Something formless yet undeniably there, watching him, waiting for his reaction. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but when he spoke, his voice still trembled. "Who are you?" The space around him seemed to pause in response. No immediate answer came, only silence. Thick, suffocating, pressing against his chest as if the very air was squeezing the breath from his lungs. Then, the voice spoke again, slow, deep, laced with something unreadable. "You know who I am." A shiver ran down James's spine. Not because it answered his question, but because it made everything worse. A simple phrase, yet it felt like a cold blade slicing through his mind, leaving behind a suffocating unease. James shook his head, cold sweat forming on his forehead. "I don't know. Who are you?" He pressed, clinging to reason, hoping for some logical explanation, anything that would make sense of this nightmare. This time, the voice didn't laugh. It didn't rush to respond either. It lingered, as if considering his question, or perhaps savoring his fear, before finally speaking again. "I have always been here, always waiting." James's breath caught in his throat. Always here? What did that mean? He had never set foot in this place before. But if the voice wasn't lying, had it been watching him long before he arrived? The darkness around him felt heavier, thicker. James took a step back, but his foot only met cold, uneven stone. No way out. "What are you?" His voice came out quieter this time, almost as if he feared the answer. And when the voice spoke again, its tone dropped lower, filled with an unsettling certainty. "I am what you have always feared." James's heart pounded violently against his chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the deathly stillness around him. The bone-chilling cold seeped into his skin, but it wasn't the temperature that made him tremble. It was the presence. That voice. It didn't belong to the world of the living. It wasn't just a being standing before him. It was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the darkness itself. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as if coated in an invisible dust of decay. A terrifying thought crept into his mind. This was not a human, nor a lost soul. There was only one kind of entity that could exist in this kind of abyss, one that every civilization had spoken of with dread. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he forced out the words, "Are you the devil?" The moment he spoke, James felt a shift in the air. Something, unseen yet undeniable, stirred around him. It was as if the very space around him vibrated with an eerie rhythm, as though reality itself had shuddered at his question. Then a soft chuckle echoed in the void. Not loud, but enough to send a sharp chill down his spine. It wasn't the laughter of a man. There was no amusement, no mockery, only a quiet, enigmatic satisfaction, as if the entity before him was savoring every second of his fear. "Why would I be the devil?" James froze. That was not a denial. It was something else, something far more dangerous. A lure, an invitation to go deeper into the unknown, to step willingly into a trap he couldn't see. "You didn't deny it." His voice was steadier than he expected. "Must I?" The voice responded, slow and deliberate, each word striking his mind like a hammer. The darkness thickened, swallowing the space around him. James felt as if he was standing on the razor's edge between sanity and an abyss of unimaginable terror. If this entity was truly the devil, then that meant he had stepped into a place where no human was ever meant to go. Fear wrapped around James like an invisible net, tightening with every breath he took. The darkness surrounding him was so absolute that he could no longer tell what was real and what was an illusion. Only the voice, haunting and ever-present, seeped into every corner of his mind, as if it had been here long before he arrived. His body tensed, every muscle coiled, veins pulsing beneath his cold skin. He didn't know what this entity was, but one thing was certain. It did not belong to the world of the living. And what unsettled him even more was the question lingering in his mind. Why was he here? Swallowing dryly, he forced himself to speak, keeping his voice as steady as possible, though a slight tremor still betrayed his fear. "Why am I here?" Silence. James could feel something, not wind, not sound, but a presence, moving around him. Then the voice answered, deep and unreadable as before. "What do you think?" His fists clenched. The tension in his body was unbearable. The entity wasn't giving him an answer, only leading him in circles, playing a game with his mind. Grinding his teeth, he fought to suppress his growing panic. "I don't know, but you do." This time, the voice let out a soft chuckle. Not one of amusement, but something deeper, more twisted, as if it was savoring his confusion. "Yes, I do." The air grew heavier, suffocating. James could feel it now. The entity was getting closer, though he still couldn't see a thing. "Then tell me." His voice hardened, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. There was a pause. Then the voice spoke again, slow, deliberate, unshakable. "You chose this path." James froze. Chose. Number that couldn't be. He had never chosen to be here. He didn't want to be here. But if he had truly chosen, then had fate been leading him to this place all along, without him ever realizing it? The space around James seemed to shrink, the air thickening to the point where he felt as if he were sinking into an endless abyss. The darkness still enveloped everything, but he realized something. It was not merely the absence of light. It was a presence, something alive, watching him. The voice spoke again, this time slower, as if carefully weighing each word. You humans have never truly believed in anything. James frowned slightly, though the fear pressing against his chest remained. What did that mean? He didn't understand. What are you talking about? He tried to keep his voice steady, but even he could hear the tremble in his words. A soft chuckle echoed through the void, not loud, yet enough to make the hairs on his neck stand on end. It wasn't mocking, nor was it threatening. It carried something else, something resembling quiet disappointment. You claim to believe in heaven, yet when faced with death, you beg to live. A chill ran down James's spine. The voice wasn't raised, wasn't accusing, yet every word cut through him like a blade. You claim to believe in demons, yet when confronted with darkness, you search for a rational explanation. James swallowed hard. There was an undeniable truth in those words. You claim to believe in fate, yet when life doesn't go as you wish, you blame injustice. The darkness around him felt heavier, denser, as if each word was pulling him deeper into this endless void. Humans always say they believe, but in the end, they believe in nothing. James felt his chest tighten. He didn't know if he was arguing with something truly sinister, but the things it said, they weren't entirely wrong. But why was it telling him this? Why here? Why now? And most importantly, if humans had never truly believed in anything, then why was he so afraid? James stood frozen, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. The darkness around him wasn't just the absence of light. It was something else, something alive, creeping into his mind, seeping into every thought. The voice still echoed, low and haunting, like a whisper of secrets that were never meant to be revealed. Do you know what the greatest deception is? James didn't answer. His throat was dry, his body rigid, as if any movement might send him tumbling into an endless abyss. But the voice didn't need him to respond. It continued, slow and deliberate, each word carving itself into the air around him. We never needed to do anything, never needed to whisper in your ears, never needed to lead you into mistakes, because the greatest deception we ever created was convincing the world that we don't exist. A chilling shiver ran down James's spine. The words rang out like a verdict, absolute and undeniable. Every cell in his body screamed at him, warning that this was not a joke. Do you think humans simply forgot our presence? No, James. We never left. You merely convinced yourselves that you were safe. James clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms hard enough to sting. The fear in his chest was no longer just a fleeting panic. It was real, tangible, swallowing his mind whole. Have you ever wondered why every civilization, every religion, every culture in the world speaks of us? Why you fear the dark? Why you fear what lurks in the corners of your room? Why certain dreams leave your heart pounding when you wake? James couldn't speak. It, whatever it was speaking of a truth humanity had always avoided. Because deep down, you know I am still here, and I never left. The darkness around him thickened, as if those words had stirred something from the depths, something that had always been lurking just beyond the edges of reality. Tim James trembled, his hands clenching tightly as if trying to grasp onto something tangible amidst the suffocating darkness. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his heartbeat pounding so violently that it felt as if his chest might shatter. The words still echoed in his mind, like an ancient curse latching onto his very soul. "No, that's impossible," James muttered, desperately trying to push back the rising fear flooding his veins. He could not believe those words. It was lying. It had to be. This was a trick, a way to make him doubt, to break him. His fists tightened, his eyes shutting for a brief moment before reopening, now filled with determination. But God still exists. His voice, though slightly unsteady, held firm conviction. The silence that followed was unnatural. James could feel it, an invisible shift in the air, as if the darkness itself was considering his words. Then, a quiet chuckle rippled through the void, low and drawn out, carrying a strange sense of amusement. "Is that so?" The voice replied, slow and deliberate, savoring each syllable. A cold shiver crawled down James's spine, but he refused to waver. God is real, and he never leaves us alone in the dark. This time, the chuckle grew into something deeper, darker, laced with unmistakable mockery. "If that's true, James, then ask yourself this. When you wandered into this place, when you stood before me, where was your God?" James froze. He wanted to deny it, to shout that God was still watching over him, that this was merely a test. But was that really true? "I do not lie, James. I never needed to. You are afraid, not because I have made you doubt, but because deep down, you have already doubted for a long time." The darkness grew heavier, pressing against him like an unseen force tightening around his chest. James struggled to breathe, his heart pounding in his ears. And then, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. Had he, in the very moment he declared his faith, already begun to question it? The space around James suddenly trembled. At first, it was just a faint vibration, like the ground beneath him was subtly shifting. But within mere moments, it grew violent. The air grew heavy, so heavy, it felt as though the entire world was exhaling a long, authoritative breath. An invisible pressure weighed down on his body, forcing his knees to buckle. From within the darkness, the voice spoke again. This time, devoid of mockery or amusement. It was deep, resonant, and carried an unfathomable power, something far beyond anything James had ever known. "I am God." James froze. His entire body felt as if it were being pulled into an unseen vortex, his thoughts dissolving into nothingness. The declaration struck him like a bolt of lightning, tearing through everything he had ever believed. "No, that's not possible," he murmured, but his voice lacked the conviction it once held. The entity did not justify itself, did not argue. It did not need to raise its voice or force its will. It simply spoke with absolute authority. And that was what terrified him the most. The world continued to quake. The darkness around him began to shift. It was no longer just an empty void, but something alive. Something that writhed, that moved, that laughed. You have placed your faith in something you never truly understood. But now you have no choice but to accept the truth. James stepped back, but there was nowhere left to run. The shadows closed in, swallowing him whole. Each breath he took crushed beneath the overwhelming presence of whatever stood before him. "If you still do not believe," the voice lowered, a final whisper before everything unraveled, "then pray to me." James opened his mouth to protest, but it was too late. An unseen force yanked him into the abyss, his body suspended in the void. The prayer caught in his throat, and then there was nothing. Story 2. The Friend in the Old Wardrobe. Some stories may seem harmless, but when coincidences become too strange, is it still just imagination? A mysterious friend in an old wardrobe, Nightmares haunting multiple generations. What is the truth? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chilling stories. When I was a child, I had an imaginary friend. But he wasn't just any ordinary friend. He lived inside an old, worn-out wooden wardrobe in the corner of my room. That wardrobe always gave me a strange feeling, a mix of eerie fascination and unexplainable dread. I don't remember exactly when I started talking to him, but his presence somehow became a natural part of my childhood. I called him by a simple name, Peter. Peter never stepped out of the wardrobe, but he always listened when I spoke. He told me stories, many stories. I remember his voice clearly, but if you asked me now what those stories were about, I wouldn't be able to tell you. They feel like a distant haze, fading from my memory over time. But back then, I wasn't afraid. In fact, I thought he was a real friend. One day, I casually told my parents about Peter. My father, who was often away on business trips, froze the moment he heard me mention the name. He looked at me intently, his face suddenly turning pale. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Something heavy, something tense settled in. I didn't understand why. Didn't all kids have imaginary friends? You said, he lives in that wardrobe? My father asked, his voice trembling. I nodded. My father took a deep breath, as if trying to steady himself. Then he asked if I could draw Peter. I didn't think much of it and quickly grabbed some paper and a pencil, sketching out his image. When I handed him the drawing, he barely glanced at it before turning away abruptly. His entire body went rigid, like he had just seen something that shouldn't exist. The very next morning, my father and uncle quietly moved the wardrobe to the backyard. I had no idea what was happening. All I knew was that they poured gasoline over it and set it on fire. The flames roared violently, the sound of wood cracking and splitting echoing in the still air. I stood there, watching as the wardrobe turned to ash, feeling an inexplicable sense of loss and confusion. Years later, I finally learned the truth. That wardrobe had been in our family for generations. And the most terrifying part? When my uncle was a child, he also had an imaginary friend who lived in it. His name was Peter. At first, everything seemed normal, just like it had been with me. But after a few months, my uncle began to suffer from relentless nightmares. In his dreams, Peter was no longer a friendly companion. He changed. His eyes darkened, his smile twisted, and he whispered things too horrifying to recall. Then it got worse. My uncle said Peter no longer just appeared in his dreams. He started standing by the bed, watching him whenever he woke up. The suffocating fear, the overwhelming dread haunted him every night, until the family had no choice but to move him out of that room to escape the nightmare. After hearing the story, I realized something chilling. Peter had never left. He had just been waiting. And when I arrived, he found me, continuing the terrifying cycle once more. So who was Peter really? Or was he ever just an imaginary friend at all? I used to talk to him, as naturally as if he had always been there, listening to me. Peter never stepped out of that old wooden wardrobe, but his voice was always clear whenever I sat near it. He told me stories, long, detailed stories that lasted for hours. Yet strangely, I could never remember their contents afterward. All I could recall was the feeling of listening, a strange fascination mixed with a subtle chill running down my spine. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was just a child's game, the way kids create imaginary friends to keep themselves company. But over time, my conversations with Peter grew longer. I don't remember when I started getting lost in the worlds he described, only that every time he spoke, I lost all sense of time. I could sit for hours in front of that wardrobe, eyes fixed on its dark wooden door, listening to the whispers inside. Then one night, I woke up in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight slipping through the window. I didn't know why I had woken up, but something felt off, like someone else was in the room with me. A cold draft slipped through the gap in the wardrobe door. I held my breath, straining to listen. "Are you afraid?" Peter's voice. But this time, it wasn't in my head like before. It was real, closer, as if he were standing right beside me, just inches away. I clutched my blanket tightly, my heart pounding. A creeping fear slithered through my body, though I couldn't understand why. "Do you remember the stories I told you?" Peter asked, his voice still gentle. But there was something else beneath it. Something lurking, something I couldn't quite place. I opened my mouth to answer, but I couldn't. I didn't remember. Not a single story. Only fragments. Scattered pieces floating in my mind, impossible to piece together. That's when I realized something was wrong. How was that possible? I had listened to Peter tell hundreds of stories, yet not a single memory remained. A suffocating unease gripped me like an unseen hand. A soft click echoed through the silence. The wardrobe door trembled slightly, as if something inside had just brushed against it. I shrank back instantly, my eyes locked onto the wooden door. My breath came in shallow gasps, every hair on my body standing on end. "You don't remember, but I do." Peter's voice had changed. Gone was the warmth, the friendliness. Now it was deeper, slower, like he was holding something back. I wanted to run. I wanted to leap out of bed, scream for my parents, but my body refused to move. It was as if an unseen force held me in place, forcing me to listen. "Do you want to remember?" A simple question, but it sent ice through my veins. From inside the wardrobe, a faint shuffling sound, like something shifting, preparing to move. The darkness in the room seemed heavier now, closing in around me. I didn't know what would happen if I answered, but I knew that once I said yes, there would be no turning back. I clenched my fists, trying to force out a word, a refusal, anything to stop this. But before I could speak, the wardrobe door creaked softly, just enough to open a small gap. A cold breath of air seeped out, wrapping around my throat. And I saw it. A pale, bony hand, slowly reaching out from the darkness within. Everything began on a late afternoon when I casually mentioned Peter, my mysterious friend who lived inside the old wooden wardrobe in the corner of my room. I didn't think much of it. I was simply sharing, just like any other child would. But the moment that name left my lips, the atmosphere in the room shifted. My father, a man who rarely showed emotion, suddenly froze. His face turned pale, his eyes filled with something I'd never seen before. Confusion and fear. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me realize that something was wrong. My mother glanced at my father, worry flickering in her eyes. "What did you say his name was?" My father's voice was hoarse, as if he was struggling to stay composed. I blinked, suddenly feeling a chill run down my spine. "Peter, or maybe Patrick, but I like calling him Peter more." This time, I saw it clearly. His hand clenched into a fist. His entire body tensed. His breathing grew heavy, and I could swear I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "How long have you been talking to him?" His question left me confused. Why was he reacting so strongly? Peter was just an imaginary friend. But no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't ignore the tension thickening in the air. "I don't remember. A long time. Since we moved here." My mother placed a hand on my father's arm, shaking her head slightly as if urging him to stop. But he kept staring at me, his eyes filled with unease. "Have you seen him?" I hesitated. My heart pounded harder in my chest. "What do you mean?" "Peter." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Has he ever come out?" I swallowed hard. Number, he never leaves the wardrobe. Without another word, my father stood up abruptly and strode toward my room. Alarmed, I hurried after him, my mind swirling with questions. When we arrived, he stopped in front of the old wooden wardrobe, his eyes dark and unreadable. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and placed it on the door. I had never seen him like this before. This was a fear far deeper than anything that could be faked. This wardrobe. Has it always been here? I heard him mutter, his voice barely audible. I nodded, puzzled by the question. The wardrobe had been here since we moved in. It was old, heavy, and far too large for the room, but I had never thought about moving it. Then my father turned to me, hesitation flickering in his eyes. Can you draw him? I frowned. Draw what? Your friend. I didn't understand, but I did as he asked. I grabbed a piece of paper, sat on the floor, and began sketching Peter from memory. I drew his face, his deep-set eyes, his gentle smile, the one I always imagined when I thought of him. When I handed the drawing to my father, he barely glanced at it before his face turned ghostly pale. His grip on the paper tightened until it crumpled. I had never seen him look so terrified. Without saying a word, he threw the drawing onto the table and rushed out of the room. My mother and I exchanged bewildered looks, neither of us understanding what was happening. That night, I heard my parents whispering in the living room. Their voices were so low that I had to press my ear against the door to catch their words. It's identical. How is that possible? My mother murmured. I don't know, but I'm not letting this happen again. I had no idea what they were talking about, but one thing was clear. My father did not see Peter as just a child's game, and if something could scare a man like him, maybe I should start worrying too. After the strange conversation with my father, I felt an unsettling sense of unease, though I couldn't quite explain why. Peter wasn't a bad person. He was always gentle, patiently listening to me and telling fascinating stories. Stories that, no matter how hard I tried, I could never quite remember. But my father's reaction made me start to wonder, was there something about Peter I didn't know? That night, I sat at my desk, the soft yellow glow of my lamp illuminating the blank sheet of paper before me. I gripped my pencil tightly, an inexplicable uneasiness settling in my chest. I had never drawn Peter before, yet his image was always vivid in my mind, as if he truly existed, rather than just being an imaginary friend. The pencil moved across the paper, dark hair falling over a high forehead, deep, hollow eyes, unreadable, a faint smile, both friendly and unsettling. I kept drawing, each detail becoming clearer, but the more I sketched, the more my hand trembled. Something was off. I wasn't sure what I had unconsciously added, but when I finally looked at the drawing, my heart pounded against my ribs. Peter didn't look the way I had always imagined him. He looked different. His eyes weren't just deep shadows. They seemed to hide an abyss, an endless darkness lurking behind them. His smile wasn't gentle anymore. It stretched unnaturally, as if some unseen force was pulling the corners of his mouth too far. I swallowed hard, feeling cold sweat on my forehead. Something wasn't right. A draft of cold air slipped through the window, sending a shiver down my spine. Instinctively, I turned to look at the wooden wardrobe where Peter always stayed. It stood silently in the dark, just as it always had. But now, it felt less like a piece of furniture and more like a doorway, one that was only slightly ajar, waiting for something to step through. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my friend. The next morning, I placed the drawing on the dining table, waiting for my father to come downstairs. When he saw it, I had braced myself for a strong reaction, but I hadn't expected him to nearly drop his coffee cup. His face turned pale. My uncle, my father's younger brother, happened to be in the kitchen at that moment. When his eyes landed on the drawing, he froze, his expression shifting from confusion to outright horror. "How do you know?" my father asked, his voice rough. I blinked in confusion. "Know what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exchanged a look with my uncle, one filled with meaning I couldn't grasp. Then, as if reaching a decision, he grabbed the drawing and crushed it in his hand. "Come on." His voice was flat, unreadable. "Go where?" I asked. "To do what should have been done a long time ago." We stepped into the backyard. My father and uncle moved the wooden wardrobe outside. I had no idea how they managed to lift something so heavy, but it was clear they had prepared for this. Before I could fully process what was happening, they had already set it down in an open patch of land and doused it in kerosene. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Wait," I stammered. "What are you doing?" My father looked at me, his gaze filled with a fear I had never seen in him before. "This wardrobe should not exist," he said simply. The fire ignited instantly. Flames consumed the aged wood, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning varnish. I stood frozen, watching as the fire devoured the wardrobe. At first, I felt relief, like something dark and unnatural was finally being erased from existence. But then, I heard it. A faint sound beneath the crackling of flames. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But as the fire roared higher, the sound became clearer. Whispers. Fragmented words, incoherent. Yet the voice was familiar enough to send ice through my veins. I went rigid. "No way." My father heard it too. I knew because his face drained of all color, and my uncle took a step back, eyes wide with terror. The whispers grew, layer upon layer, as if something inside the wardrobe was desperately trying to speak. A voice, raspy, pleading, resentful. And then, just before the fire swallowed everything, a piercing scream tore through the air. Cold, furious. I clamped my hands over my ears, my heartbeat hammering wildly. And in that moment, I felt it. A gaze. Not from my father, not from my uncle, but from somewhere else. Somewhere inside the flames. A pair of deep black eyes, glowing with a faint red light before vanishing completely. The fire slowly died down, leaving behind only a pile of ash. No one spoke for a long time. The wind howled through the empty yard, carrying away the last remnants of the wardrobe's remains. Peter was gone. But then why? Did it feel like he had never truly left? I had thought everything ended the day the wooden wardrobe burned to ashes. The crimson flames had consumed it entirely, reducing it to nothing. I tried to convince myself that Peter no longer existed, that he had been nothing more than a childhood game, a nightmare conjured up by an overactive imagination. But there was one thing I couldn't explain. After the wardrobe was gone, my memories of Peter began to fade. I could no longer recall his face, his voice, or the stories he used to tell. It was as if he had never existed, or worse, as if he had never left. Years passed, and I gradually forgot about it. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still felt those eyes, deep, black, hiding something I could never quite understand. I would wake in the middle of the night, cold sweat running down my spine. Yet every time I tried to remember, all that remained were hazy, distorted images. Until one day, I discovered the horrifying truth. That day, my family gathered for a reunion. My uncle was there too. Though I hadn't seen him in years, he hadn't changed much, still carrying that serious demeanor, though his eyes held a weariness I couldn't quite place. As the meal went on, the conversation drifted to old memories. I don't know why I brought up the wardrobe. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the lingering curiosity that had never truly left me. I turned to my uncle and casually asked, "Do you remember the old wooden wardrobe at Grandpa and Grandma's house?" The air in the room shifted. My uncle set his glass down, staring at me. A heavy silence settled over the table. A chill ran down my spine as I realized his reaction was exactly like my father's all those years ago, when I first told him about Peter. After a long pause, my uncle finally spoke, his voice distant, as if echoing from a faraway past. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I didn't understand. "Saw what?" He fell silent for a moment, then let out a weary sigh. "You had a friend who lived in that wardrobe, didn't you?" I froze. My heart seemed to stop beating. How did he know? I had never told anyone except my father. A wave of unease washed over me. I swallowed hard. "Why would you ask that?" My uncle looked at me, and there was no mistaking it. Fear. A deep, profound fear I had never seen in his eyes before. Because I had a friend like that too. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thick and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for him to continue. When I was a child, I had an imaginary friend. He lived in the wooden wardrobe. He told me stories every night, whispered to me when everything was dark. And he had a name: Peter. My chest tightened. The warmth of the fireplace did nothing to chase away the sudden cold that seeped into my bones. I didn't know what to say. My whole body went rigid as blurry memories rushed back. The whispered conversations in the dark, the strange dreams, the constant feeling of being watched. "I drew him once too," my uncle went on, his voice rough. "And when I showed my father the drawing, he burned it immediately. After that, the wardrobe disappeared." But he hesitated. I already knew what he was going to say, and it terrified me. But he still came back. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" My uncle studied me for a long moment before slowly rolling up his sleeve. A scar ran down his forearm, faint but unmistakable, as if something had clawed deep into his skin. "I thought it was just nightmares," he murmured. "But every time I tried to forget, he would appear in my dreams again." A shiver crawled down my spine. My eyes locked onto the scar, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Then, how did you get rid of him?" My voice barely came out. My uncle let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "I'm not sure I ever did." The silence was suffocating. I felt it again, that presence. The eerie sensation of someone standing just behind me, watching, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. Peter. He had never truly disappeared. After that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about what my uncle had said. The thought that Peter had once appeared in his childhood, the exact same way he had appeared in mine, sent chills down my spine. What did it mean? Who was he? Or rather, what was he? But even with all my doubts, I wasn't prepared to hear the rest of the story, the part my uncle had never told anyone. At first, everything seemed normal, he began, his voice low and heavy, as if every word carried the weight of a painful memory. After my father burned the drawing and the wardrobe disappeared, I never saw Peter again. I started to believe he was just a fragment of a child's imagination, that it was all over. But it wasn't over. A few months later, the nightmares began. He took a deep breath, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the edge of the table. At first, they were just strange, blurry dreams, disjointed images. A long, endless hallway, a dark room, whispers echoing in the shadows. But as time passed, the dreams became more vivid and more terrifying. I held my breath. I dreamed I was standing in my old room, right in front of the wooden wardrobe. The doors trembled slightly as if something was inside. A strange feeling crept over me. An overwhelming fear, but also an inexplicable urge. Part of me wanted to run, but another part wanted to open it. His voice trembled. And then, the door slowly creaked open, A shiver ran down my spine, like an icy breath against the back of my neck. Peter was there. My heart pounded. He hadn't changed at all. The same black hair falling over his forehead, the same deep, dark eyes, the same familiar smile. But something was wrong. My uncle paused, as if searching for the right words. That smile, it wasn't friendly anymore. It was twisted, distorted, like his mouth was being stretched by an invisible hand. And when he spoke, he swallowed hard. His voice wasn't the same. It was hollow, cold. Something not human. A tightness gripped my chest. "What did he say?" I asked, though a part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. My uncle looked at me, fear flickering in his eyes. He said, "Do you remember me?" I froze. A gust of wind slipped through the window, sending a chill down my spine. After that night, I couldn't sleep anymore, my uncle continued. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Every time I drifted off, I found myself back in front of that wardrobe. Sometimes, in my dreams, he would just stand there, smiling, staring at me. But sometimes, he clenched his fists. Sometimes, he would move closer. A suffocating pressure built in my chest. And one night, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I realized I wasn't in my bed anymore. I went rigid. I was standing in front of my closet. The door was slightly open, and the moment I realized it, I heard a whisper from inside. Cold sweat trickled down my back. "Open it." My uncle closed his eyes, as if just recalling that moment was unbearable. I don't know how I escaped. All I remember is waking up the next morning with scratches on my arms, deep marks, like someone had tried to drag me inside. A heavy silence filled the room. I barely dared to breathe. "Did you ever open it?" I whispered. He shook his head, but his eyes held a fear I couldn't fully understand. "No," he said quietly. But I knew. If I did, I would never come back. An invisible chill crept through the room, settling deep into my bones. I felt it again, that presence, the unshakable feeling that someone was standing right behind me, silently watching. Maybe Peter had never truly disappeared. My uncle told me that after waking up in front of the wardrobe with scratches on his arms, things only got worse. The nightmares didn't just happen in his sleep. They started creeping into his waking life. At first, it was just fleeting hallucinations. A shadow flickering in the corner of his eye, a whisper so faint he couldn't tell if it was real or just his imagination. But soon, everything became clearer. He said that some nights, while lying in bed, he could feel someone standing right beside him. It wasn't just a vague sensation, it was a presence, a real one. He could hear soft breathing, feel the air grow unnaturally cold. Sometimes he even saw a dark silhouette reflected in the window. But whenever he turned around, there was nothing there. It was driving him insane. He became exhausted from the lack of sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, Peter was there. His twisted smile, his hollow black eyes. He never said much. He just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something. Then, one night, my uncle had a dream that shook him to his core. He dreamt he was being dragged down a long, endless hallway. It felt like hundreds of hands were clawing at him, pulling him deeper into an inescapable darkness. He screamed, struggled, but the more he fought, the tighter their grip became. He woke up gasping for air, his wrists covered in bruises. When things became unbearable, the family started to worry. My father was the first to notice. He saw my uncle growing weaker, his eyes distant, his skin pale as if life itself was draining out of him. My mother later told me that some nights, when she walked past his room, she could hear whispers coming from inside. But the most terrifying thing happened on a stormy night. My father woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. Scratching. It was coming from my uncle's room. A deep sense of unease filled him as he got out of bed. As he approached the door, the sound became clearer. Sharp, relentless, like nails raking against wood. He turned the doorknob, and what he saw made his blood run cold. My uncle was sitting on the floor, his back facing the door, his trembling hands clawing at the wall so violently that his fingertips were bleeding. His breathing was ragged, his clothes drenched in sweat. When my father stepped closer, my uncle flinched and whipped around, his eyes wild, as if he didn't recognize him. "What are you doing?" my father asked, trying to keep his voice steady. My uncle gasped for air, lifting his bloodshot eyes to meet my father's. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that made my father's skin crawl. He never left. My father didn't ask anything else. He knew what was happening, and he knew that if my uncle stayed in that room any longer, he might never come back the same. The next morning, the family decided to move him out of that room. My father packed up his things and relocated him to another part of the house, anywhere far from that place. The old room was locked. No one dared go near it again. But while gathering his belongings, they found something that left them all speechless. Underneath his mattress was a drawing, a rushed, frantic sketch, but unmistakable. A boy, with hollow black eyes and a twisted, eerie smile. Peter. My uncle swore he had never drawn it. After hearing my uncle's story, I couldn't shake the image of the drawing beneath the mattress. Those deep, black eyes, that twisted smile, and the shadow of something that didn't belong to this world. The eerie feeling clung to me for days. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a series of coincidences. Maybe it really was nothing more than hallucinations conjured by a child's overactive imagination. Maybe my uncle and I had simply accidentally imagined the same imaginary friend. But then, I remembered the look in my father's eyes when he heard the name Peter. That wasn't the look of someone hearing about a childhood game. That was real fear. I started digging deeper. I searched through old photos, fragmented memories of the house I'd lived in as a child. And there was something I'd never noticed before: the wooden wardrobe. There wasn't a single clear picture of it. Every photograph taken in my room had somehow cut off the corner where the wardrobe had once stood, as if something, some unseen force, didn't want it to be captured. I asked my father about it. At first, he avoided the question, but when I insisted, he fell silent for a long time before finally saying in a hushed voice, "It wasn't ours." I froze. When we moved into that house, the wardrobe was already there. Your mother and I thought about getting rid of it, but every time we tried, something would happen. It was as if something didn't want to leave. A shiver ran down my spine. And when you started talking about Peter, my father's voice grew even quieter. I knew it wasn't over. His words made it hard to breathe. So everything my uncle and I had experienced wasn't just our imagination. Peter, or whatever he really was, had been there long before us, waiting for someone to talk to him, to play with him, to let him take root inside their mind. I asked my father if he believed Peter was real. He was silent for a long time. Then he simply said, "Some things are better left unknown." I tried to forget, tried to convince myself that it was all just a strange coincidence. But then, one night, while cleaning out my room, I found something wedged under the corner of my bed. A drawing. The paper was old, the pencil strokes slightly smudged, but the image was unmistakable. A boy with hollow black eyes and a distorted, eerie smile. I was certain I had never drawn it. So then, who did? And more importantly, had he ever really left?